أكبر الله أكبر حي على الصلاة الله أكبر.
At this time I rise, giving the highest of praise to the great God of the universe, Allah, and the highest of honors to his prophet, Noble Drew Ali, Islam. I give honors to the Temple number 19, the office of the Grand Governor, the office of the Lieutenant Grand Governor, the office of the Chairman, the office of the Secretary, all the Ills and Bays, the Vanguard staff, all the visitors. I'm going to be brief. I just want to read some things. I want to look at the last paragraph of the Divine Constitution, not the Divine Constitution, the Divine Warning by the Prophet for the Nations. So it says, I, the prophet, am hereby calling aloud with a divine plea to all true American citizens to help me to remove this great sin which has been committed and is being practiced by my people in the United States of America, because they know it is not the true and divine way, and without understanding, they have fallen from the true light into utter darkness of sin, and there is not a nation on earth today that will recognize them socially, religiously, politically, or economically, etc., in their present condition of their endeavorment, in which they themselves try to enforce upon a civilized world. They will not refrain from their sinful ways of action, and their deeds have brought Jim Crowism, segregation, and everything that brings harm to human beings on earth. And they fought the Southerner for all these great misuses. But I have traveled in the South and have examined conditions there. And it is the works of my people continuously practicing the things which bring dishonor, disgrace, and disrespect to any nation that lives the life. And I am hereby calling on all true American citizens for moral support and finance to help me in my great missionary work to bring my people out of darkness into marvelous light. So let's look at a few things from here. So, the deeds have brought Jim Crowism, segregation. We'll just write them down. 1, 2, 3. Jim Crowism. Segregation. And everything that brings harm. All right, so real quick, I'll read about what Jim Crowism is. And if anyone has any comments, then feel free to raise your hand, and we can have some dialogue if you would like. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States, enacted by, and it says white, Democrat-dominated state legislatures after the Reconstruction period in the late 19th century. And by the way, this is from Wikipedia, so we can kind of take what Wikipedia says, as they say, with the proverbial grain of salt, but this is still the information that the public, that is available to the public. And the Divine Warning is also out there to the public. All right, the laws were enforced until 1965. In practice, Jim Crow laws mandated racial segregation in all public facilities in the states of the former Confederate States of America starting in the 1870s and 1880s, and were upheld in 1896 by the U.S. Supreme Court's separate but equal legal doctrine for African Americans established with the court's decision in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Moreover, public education had essentially been segregated since its establishment in most of the South after the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. So, Jim Crowism, according to Wikipedia, went on for how long? Until 1965. All right. I'll say went until 1965. The legal principle of separate but equal racial segregation was extended to public facilities and transportation, including the coaches of interstate trains and buses. Facilities for African Americans were consistently inferior and underfunded compared to the facilities, or it says white Americans. Sometimes there were no so-called black facilities. As a body of law, this was law. All right, Jim Crow is of laws. As a body of law, Jim Crow institutionalized economic, education, and social disadvantages for African Americans. Now, how long did they say this was going on until? 19. That's what it says. As a body of law, Jim Crow institutionalized economic, educational, and social disadvantages for African Americans. So we're going to put an asterisk here. Legalized racial segregation principally existed in the southern states, while northern racial segregation generally was a matter of fact, enforced in housing with private covenants in leases, bank lending practices, and employment preference discrimination, including labor union practices. 1965, all right. Jim Crow laws, sometimes as in Florida, part of state constitutions, mandated the segregation of public schools, public places, and public transportation, and the segregation of restrooms, restaurants, and drinking fountains for, it says, whites and blacks. The U.S. military was already segregated. President Woodrow Wilson, a Southern Democrat, initiated segregation of federal workplaces at the request of Southern cabinet members in 1913. We'll write that down. Federal workplaces segregated. In 1913. All right. Think about what is a federal workplace? Give me an example. Who has a federal job? What is a federal workplace? Oh, we don't have to do all that, but I mean, just think about it. Federal hospitals were segregated. What do we have downtown? We have a federal building. Social Security office. All of the federal offices, they were segregated. In 1913. What happened in 1913? Who came in 1913? Prophet Noble Drew Ali came in 1913. When was the Moorish Science Temple of America founded? 1913. All right. These Jim Crow laws revived principles of the 1865 and 1866 Black Codes. Revived 1865 and 66 Black Codes. So they say it went until 1965, but you see we have an asterisk right here. This asterisk, we'll just get into notes of the question. They say 1965, I don't know. It's kind of suspect. which had previously restricted the civil rights and civil liberties of African Americans. Segregation of public, state-sponsored schools was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. In some states, it took years to implement this decision. Generally, the remaining Jim Crow laws were overruled by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Oh, that's why they say it ended, huh? Oh, yeah? Do we still have institutionalized economic and educational and social disadvantages? So-called African Americans? But years of action and court challenges have been needed to unravel the many means of institutional discrimination. Okay. All right. So, any questions on Jim Crow before we move on to segregation?
What is Jim Crow?
So, Jim Crow is actually, when I read up on it, it's kind of like a caricature or a joke. And as you moved on in this, as I was reading it, it means they just use it interchangeably with Negro.
Okay.
So Jim Crow, like, you know, like it's Crow, Jim Crow. So Jim Crowism, it means Negro. Racial segregation. So the works of our people clinging to names and principles that delude to slavery brought about Jim Crowism. All right? Us referring to ourselves as the Negro and clinging to that until 1965 brought all of the things that we fought the Southerner for. Racial segregation is the separation of people into racial or other ethnic groups in daily life. It may apply to activities such as eating in a restaurant, drinking from a water fountain, using a public toilet, attending school, going to the movies, riding on a bus, or in the rental or purchase of a home or of hotel rooms. Segregation is defined by the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance as the act by which a natural or legal person separates other persons on the basis of one of the enumerated grounds without an objective and reasonable justification in conformity with the proposed definition of discrimination. As a result, the voluntary act of separating oneself from other people on the basis of one of the enumerated grounds does not constitute segregation. According to the UN Forum on Minority Issues, the creation and development of classes in schools providing education in minority languages should not be considered impermissible segregation if the assignment to such classes in schools is of a voluntary nature. Racial segregation is generally outlawed but may exist de facto through social norms, even when there is no strong individual preference for it, as suggested by Thomas Schelling's models of segregation and subsequent work. Segregation may be maintained by means ranging from discrimination in hiring and in the rental and sale of housing to certain races to vigilante violence such as lynchings. Generally, a situation that arises when members of different races mutually prefer to associate and do business with members of their own race would usually be described as separation or de facto separation of the races rather than segregation. I'm going to stop right there. We're going to deal with segregation. All right. So when did it talk about segregation in hiring? Housing. Loans and banking. even going to the movie. So we'll put social. So again, what do we have here so far? Clinging to names and principles that delude to slavery lead to Jim Crowism, segregation, and everything that brings harm. Segregation, we have hiring, housing, loans, and social segregation. We do this to ourselves, clinging to names and principles that delude to slavery. Also, lynchings. Lynchings is listed under segregation. So when we do those things, we're actually separate. So it says that it doesn't deal with other people separating themselves from us. We're separating ourselves. Segregation can involve spatial segregation of the races and mandatory use of different institutions, such as schools and hospitals, by people of different races. So, next we'll look at everything that brings harm and say a few things, and then we'll yield the floor. Any questions up until this point? Segregation. Okay, I think we all realize what segregation is. All right, the harm principle holds that the actions of individuals should only be limited to prevent harm to other individuals. John Stuart Mill articulated this principle on liberty, where he argued that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. An equivalent was earlier stated in France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen of 1789, as liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. These limits can only be determined by law. So the limits of the harm principle is determined by law. Limits determined by law. So in 3 quick steps, we see that the conditions of our people have been determined by law. The conditions that we're going through, it's legal. If we cling to names and principles that delude to slavery, we have no rights. We talk about political rights, but we have no human rights. We have no divine rights. And this is what nationality, it does. Political rights, divine rights. We can start with the divine rights. Rights endowed by the Creator. You know, a lot of people like to throw around the 14th and 15th Amendment, but we know that the 14th and 15th Amendment were not needed for the salvation of our people. Islam. But look at the 14th and 15th Amendment. What does it say? All what born? All persons born, right? Well, can a person be a Negro, black, or a color? No, sir. No. We're made in the image and likeness of our Father God Allah. Long Islam. So when we try to force these things upon a civilized world, we are shunned and cause the segregation. Now, this is not to speak radical or agitating against any organized groups. And, you know, I have a list of organizations here, but I don't think I want to read them. But I mean, we get the point. How many organizations are the Black such and such organization and professional organizations? So we fought the Southerner to end segregation and Jim Crowism, but then we separate ourselves though. So instead of joining the American Association of, I don't know, engineers or something, we want to form our own black organizations of engineers and associations. So these are the kinds of works and things that we must be aware of that are going on. With that, I leave you as I came in peace.